You are listening to the Toxic Mold Podcast with Steve Worsley, the toxic mold expert and your number one source for mold consulting and mitigation in the USA. Let's dive into a brand new episode. Before we get started on this episode, here's a not so short disclaimer. While all attempts have been made to verify the content provided in this podcast, neither the podcaster or the producers assume any responsibility for errors, omissions, or alternative interpretations of the issues discussed here. All information stated in this podcast is the opinion of Steve Worsley. Steve Worsley is a mold specialist with over 25 years of experience in the construction and mold industry. The Toxic Mold Podcast is for information sharing purposes only. The views expressed are those of the podcaster and his alone. These views should not be taken as expert instruction or commands. While there may be references to medical conditions and symptoms, all podcast episodes are the opinion of Steve Worsley, and any medical questions or concerns shall be addressed with the appropriate licensed medical professional or professionals. As the podcaster refers to different mold types, please be aware that Steve Worsley is not a microbiologist, and questions concerning mold specifics should be answered by the appropriate professional. Steve isn't, nor does he offer any legal advice. For any legal advice, you must speak with a lawyer. The listener is 100% responsible for his or her own actions. You can check out Steve's books on Amazon. Just go to Amazon and search for author Steve Worsley. You can also take Steve's courses on Udemy or Skillshare, and you can find out more about those at cnccontractorservices.com. Now, let's get to the episode.
In today's episode, we have the pleasure of interviewing Dr. Terri Fox. Dr. Fox is a holistic, integrative, functional medicine doctor in Boulder, Colorado, where she founded Boulder Holistic Medicine. Dr. Fox did her medical training at the University of California, San Francisco Medical School. She has practiced functional medicine for nearly 20 years and is board certified by the American Board of Integrative Holistic Medicine. Dr. Fox is also a founding member of ICI. Dr. Fox brings a unique blend of Western medicine, herbal medicine, nutrition, and exercise counseling, supplements, and stress reduction techniques. Last year, Dr. Fox was featured in episode 213 of the Toxic Mold Podcast. Dr. Fox was kind enough to come back for another interview prior to releasing her masterclass and webinars. In today's episode, we talk about Dr. Fox's new course. We touch on the important issues when it comes to mold toxicity. Dr. Fox will tell us how she prefers to test for mycotoxins and what to expect during the detoxing process. Dr. Fox will explain why the timing of mold detoxing is important. On behalf of myself and all of our listeners, we'd like to thank Dr. Fox for her interview. We will post the links to her masterclass and her upcoming webinars. Now, let's get to the episode. Hello, you're listening to the Toxic Mold Podcast with myself, Steve Worsley. And today we have a wonderful guest. She actually was kind enough to come last year, but we have Dr. Terri Fox. Dr. Fox, how are you?
I'm doing great today. How are you doing?
Doing well. It's starting to get busy for our end of the business. I don't know why, but we operate kind of like contractors do. We slow down in the winter and pick back up. But we appreciate you being here. So we have a lot to talk about, and our listeners love it when they don't have to hear just me, I'm sure. And I get so many medical questions.
Right.
And of course, I'm like, well, I don't know. I get asked, how should we test, or how do I detox? And of course, that's all up to you. But you have some great news that is new this year, that you're creating a course. Do you want to tell our listeners about that?
Yeah, sure. So it's launching next week, and it's a mold treatment masterclass for patients. And so people from anywhere can do this class. So they can be in any state, or they could even be in Europe. And it's a very step by step guide you through a detox protocol. It's called my mold eradication protocol, and there's 2 steps. So, and the first step is bind and unwind, and this is sort of training your body to detox mycotoxins and mold, and opening up your detoxification channels, and beginning to, teach the body how to detox these things. And you go, until you're doing successfully phase 1 for, a certain amount of time before you can start phase 2, which is kill or be killed, or antifungals and biofilm.
So I have a question as far as how you treat these patients. Is there different treating protocols based on the mycotoxins they have, or is it all the same?
It's really important. And it's one of the things that people sort of do wrong when they're trying to treat themselves and they know they have mold and they make themselves more sick. I use a urinary mycotoxin test, and then you have the mycotoxin strains, and each different strain has a different binder that has a good affinity for it. And so your detox protocol depends exactly on your results.
Gotcha. So something that I get asked all the time, I get it. It happens in our field. I'm sure it happens a lot in your field, but you have the DIYers and then you have Dr. Google, because Dr. Google seems to know everything. And I hear a lot that people, just because they say they can't afford a doctor or whatever reason, they just start taking charcoal. So can you address these people that just think you can take charcoal and you're good to go?
Yeah, it's a bit more complicated than that. There's a lot of places that you can sort of go wrong and then end up making yourself sick. There's a real specific sort of order and flow to it for it to work well and effectively, and to completely get rid of or eradicate any mold in the system. And then there's also a lot about creating tolerance and resiliency so that you don't ever end up back there again. And you can begin to tolerate the world and even small amounts of molds. And, if you go on vacation or, that sort of thing.
Once again, I think we probably asked this last year, but I like to ask this. It's just confirmation bias on my part. But talk to our listeners how the process can go or cannot go if they don't remove themselves from the moldy environment. Because we have a lot of people, and I get it. I totally understand. You can't just up and move. But can they heal from staying in the moldy environment?
No.
Okay. Our listeners are going to be like, okay, Steve, we get it. You say this all the time. And it's just, I have a lot of people that reach out, or a lot of my clients that they think if they take supplements, which, we can go into that, supplements aren't even regulated, but they think if they start taking supplements and they get a few air doctor air purifiers, they can buy a fogger, they can buy an air scrubber. They think they're doing what we do on our side, but they're actually not. And I'm sure it's similar on the medical side. They can be making things much worse. And when I explain it, and I don't think we talked about this last time, but homes are somewhat pressurized. So you either have a positive pressure, meaning if your home's got positive pressure, it's a bubble, nothing can come in. That's pretty hard to get. You can have negative pressure where your home is sucking in outdoor air or air from the crawl space or from the attic, or you have neutral air. When our listeners, if they've done this, understand this, when they put air purifiers or fans or air scrubbers in, they could actually be pulling air from maybe their attic that they don't think they're getting. Just address the whole misnomer or myth that they can heal by buying a bunch of different things in a home that's still moldy.
There's an analogy that I use, and it's sort of like, you're in a boat that's sinking and there's a hole somewhere in the boat, and you keep bucketing out the water, and you will stay maybe sort of afloat as long as you keep bucketing out the water. But until you patch that hole, it's just never ending. Whatever mold that's in your house is going to keep releasing more and more mycotoxins into the home. And other nanoparticles and things that they emit that make us all sick. And so you won't get all the way well in a moldy house. I mean, sometimes if you get them on, the right binders and a decent protocol, and if it's a temperate area where they can have their windows open all the time and get some ventilation, like maybe they can get like this much better while they're still in there. And then to get all the way better, they really can't be in a big mold exposure. They just won't get better.
Yeah. So for our listeners, you heard it from the medical expert. Like, you have to remove yourself. Goes back to, I like to tie it in together that we have specialists like yourself, someone like myself, and even, we're all trying to learn, we're all trying to do what's best. But if you only have one person that's, say they're only focused on the home side of things, I can't help them heal. They have to have a team of us together. And I know it's difficult, but I don't understand the medical side. I'm sure you know a lot more about the home side than most medical people. But on the other hand, like,
Probably, but I couldn't do it.
exactly. You could do it, I'm sure. You just wouldn't like it. But it's important, I think, for our listeners to understand that they have to get a team of people together. Since you were on last year, we've had some clients that you've referred, and we appreciate that. But it's very common that we have to work together. And it's the medical side, the home side, the testing side, and all of that. But going back to your course, so explain to our listeners, we talked about it last year. You can't just treat me because I'm in Utah. Can you explain to our listeners how that works on that side of things? Like, you're not the treating physician.
As a medical doctor, I can only practice medicine in the states that I'm licensed. So I'm licensed in Colorado. There's other providers that can do other states, like nurse practitioners can work in multiple states and that kind of thing. But as an MD, we can only practice medicine in the state where we live. And so partially why I created this course is that I get phone calls from people all over the country, all over the world, and I can't treat them legally. And so I was trying to create a pretty easy to follow educational course where people could heal, on their own from mold toxicity. Or there is the one thing, if they do have to have a supportive physician, supportive physician doesn't need to know mold. They just have to be open to that it exists, potentially the cause of their issues. And so I have a whole guide, with a lot of functional medicine, Lyme docs, mold docs, alternative complementary medicine docs, and American Academy of Environmental Medicine. All these people will be open to mold, and many of them may not know how to treat it. So then they're pretty, often very supportive of oh, you just need a cholestyramine prescription and that kind of thing. You'll just need a couple prescriptions, but you will need a physician.
So for someone, let's just say like myself that's in Utah, can I go to just my GP and then tell him, well, Dr. Fox tells you to do this, this, and this? Explain that side of it.
Yeah, I don't think your regular GP is gonna be okay with it. I think just because it falls into an area that they know nothing about, and to their credit, do no harm, right? If they know nothing, how do they know this is not a bad thing to do? And so it's got to be somebody at least holistically oriented, more integrative, holistically oriented that would sort of have a bit of knowledge,
Okay.
about.
And they could go to ICI. We've talked about that before. That's ISEAI. And they can find physicians or, like you said, physicians' assistants or whatnot. But do you have a list of
I've had a
people? You do?
massive one, yes. Yes,
Okay.
it's a whole guide you get with the course. And worst case scenario, my partner at my office is a nurse practitioner, Dr. Amy Reedhead, and she can treat all over the country. So if you can't find somebody near you, you could always use her too.
So I want to go back to something that we talked about last year, and it's very similar as far as the testing side of it. Our listeners understand from my perspective, we can do ERMI testing, we can do EMA testing, we can just do traditional testing with air tests, tape lifts, all that fun stuff. You can go to a local hardware store and get that mold armor petri dish. As far as the medical side of it, it's similar, but to me it seems a little simpler because on the mold side, we can try all sorts of tests. Can you explain to our listeners, they go to Dr. Google, and let's say they find, well, it's not Great Plains anymore, it's Mosaic, or let's say they find Vibrant Wellness. Explain to them, and here's one of the biggest questions I get. Should I do the urine or the blood mycotoxin? And I've had it explained to me, and I think you explained it to me pretty well, but I'm not real savvy when it comes to medical. But can you explain to our listeners why you would do a urine test over the blood test?
So there's no such thing as a blood test for mycotoxins. There's a few different ways that you can get some hints about mold in the system through the blood. So there is a test. It's called myco. It's looking for antibodies to molds, to toxic molds. And I think their theory is that if the antibody levels are high, maybe you're being exposed. But for me, that just says that your body has seen the mold and developed an antibody. Our bodies have seen all molds out there. I mean, they're everywhere. So to me, that doesn't really say that that's what's making you sick or not, because it's not to me, it's not a positive mold test. It's a positive antibody to mold. And then the other thing that people often do, they're called biomarkers. This comes out of like Richie Shoemaker's work. There's things that we can draw in the blood that can show like a pattern of inflammation that is consistent with mold, that can make you suspicious of mold. So like an elevated C4A, that's part of your complement system, your inflammatory cascades, and elevated MMP9. That's a sort of biomarker for mold biofilm. There's, several of those that we can draw. And if you have insurance that covers everything, then, there's sort of a nice data point to have, because then you can retest and see if they're getting better. And it's a lot more affordable if your insurance covers the blood than retesting the mycotoxin over and over. But if your insurance doesn't cover it, I would never have somebody pay out of pocket for those, because to me, they raise suspicion. They're not diagnostic. And so to me, a urinary mycotoxin test is, okay, there's mycotoxins clearly in your urine, and they're high. That you either breathed them in that day and peed them out in your urine, or they're colonized, or you're living in it, or, so I use the urinary mycotoxins exclusively, really, for as far as even if they're like blood work, the biomarkers look really suspicious, I still make them do a mycotoxins, because then I know what strains I'm dealing with and then which binder. So like the activated charcoal is great, but it's just for the trichothecenes. It's not going to work for gliotoxin or ochratoxin A or any of the other mycotoxins. Yeah, and I have two favorite of the urinary mycotoxins. I like Vibrance. Unfortunately, you can't order a Vibrant mycotoxin without a physician, so I can't have that just available for people taking the course as a link, but if they are working with a doc or something, they could get it there. And then my favorite one is the Real-Time Labs mycotoxin. The issue with that one, it's real specific, meaning there's not a lot of false positives, but it's not as sensitive, so you'll miss some. And so what it has to be provoked, it has to have a fairly significant provocation, so the way I explain it to patients is the people that get sick from mold are the ones that can't detox it. They can't metabolize it. They can't get it out in the urine.
And just to stop you there, can you address, there's a percentage, and I've listened to different doctors.
Yeah.
Is it like 25 to 30% of the population just can't detox it?
Yep. 25 is what I hear. Yeah.
Okay. Sorry to interrupt you, but
that's okay. I actually think that number is climbing.
Really?
I do. And we can talk about why later.
We were talking about the problem that people have is they can't detox it. So
so it needs the provocation. So the people that get sick with it and can't detox, metabolize it, and get it out, it just builds. It just fills their bucket, their total body burden, until eventually it overflows and the system crashes and you get really symptomatic. And that bucket can be full of environmental toxins, plastics, pesticides, glyphosates, heavy metals, biotoxin from Lyme, all kinds of stuff. So the way I usually recommend doing it is a provocation with an IV. I might have told you this one last time. Yes. I do IV phosphatidylcholine and glutathione, and then I collect the urine. But patients on their own, if they can't find an IV like that, they can do like big doses of liposomal glutathione, and then do either ideally an infrared sauna, but if not, a hot bath right before doing the test, and that can help provoke and pull stuff out. You can even, if people have access, you can even take an antifungal medication to provoke it, because let's say I take something that kills mold. And let's say I've got mold colonized in my sinuses, for example. When I kill that mold, it releases all of its contents, which are those mycotoxins, the very same ones that made you sick in the first place. Right. Anyways, so if I provoke it, you get more mycotoxins and you get more of a sense of what's actually in the body. So there's lots of ways to provoke the real time.
Our listeners hear me talk about the EMA test, and Real-Time Labs is the EMA testing that we do. And it's interesting because a lot of people, so I'm going to just throw a scenario out to you. A lot of people think that they have to correlate on the environmental side, so the home side of it, they have to correlate the mold species that are toxigenic to their medical mycotoxin test. Can you address that? Like, for me, when I explain it to my clients, I tell them, in my opinion, we're only doing that to nail down the place of exposure. So if we don't know if it's at home, or we don't know if it's at work or in your car, can you explain though to our listeners, is it that important for my side of it, as far as we have to know where they're being exposed? Meaning, do you need to have the environmental testing like an ERMI or an EMA?
I need it in order to treat the patient?
Yes.
Is that what you're asking? No, I mean, it always feels nice to the patient when they match up,
Okay.
but they don't always. And there's so many different factors. Like, what is your body able to detox and pull out the day you do the test? I will use the information. So, like, let's say I do mycotoxin and there's no trichothecenes on it, but they bring me a report from their house and it's got tons of stacky. I'm going to cover for those trichothecenes, even though I didn't see them on the mycotoxin. Because if I
Gotcha.
know they have a huge exposure in the house, and I'm just going to add that into the protocol.
Okay. Another
Yeah.
question I
I
get,
don't need it to match.
what I want our listeners to understand is that, and this is just my opinion, and you kind of confirmed it. The environmental side's not as important to have done as it is the medical side. But, it, like you said, it makes people feel better if they do it. But, you
You mean
know,
if they get the speciation, if they get it,
yeah,
they know
exactly.
exactly. Oh, okay. Yeah. Yeah. No,
Because it's just the
it's
like, oh,
unnecessary from my
yeah,
perspective.
and it's
Yeah.
expensive on our end. The
Yeah.
the Emma test isn't cheap. I want to address the ERMI, and this is something I get all the time. And I'm not obviously a professional on the medical side, but when these people go out and get their ERMI test and they have their ERMI score, what score are you looking for to be below? Because I hear it all the time, like it's got to be below 13 or it's got to be below 11. And I'm just like, I have no idea. Like,
So
how do you feel about that?
my stance is the score does not matter at all. And that you look at the species that they found and you look at the ones that are most pathogenic and you make sure those are not too high. Is that what you were trying to get me
Yes.
to?
Yeah. Yeah. Because a
Because I
lot
don't
of,
care about the score. The score
yeah.
might be great, but they might have a 60 of stacky or something. Like I
Right.
don't care what the score says.
That's interesting because from my side of it, I agree with that because the way the ERMI's done, and I'm probably going to botch this a little bit, but they take each mold species and they more or less give it a weighting number. And something like Stacky is going to obviously be a higher number. But at the end of the day, we care more about what we're seeing there in the test results versus just a number. Because I have a ton of people that come to me and say, well, Dr. Google told me, or this Facebook group told me I got to be below 13. And it's interesting to hear an actual doctor say, it doesn't really matter. We want to look at what's there.
Yeah, and it's kind of like it's a pattern. Do they have 3 or 4 penicillium species that are all above 140? Okay, that's
Right.
starting to look a little what's the stacky? What's the chetomium? It's a little bit of pattern recognition. And I really look at it as I use it like because everybody when they have mold thinks it's not in their house. And
Yeah.
so I'm like, and if I can't convince them to get a good IEP out like yourself to like do the full home evaluation, then I say, okay, well, let's just do an ERMI and we'll see if it looks suspicious or not, and we'll go from there.
Yeah.
And but you still have to have somebody, if it's positive and it looks bad, you still have to have somebody come in and figure out where it is and do your whole, house evaluation and make recommendations.
And I totally agree. I'm a big fan of, for the most part, I care more about the property conditions
Yeah.
than I do a test result because you could actually have an IEP that's not very well versed. Maybe they're new, maybe they just don't know, but they can be testing the wrong tests to start with, testing in the wrong places.
I mean, that's
And
true. If they have somebody that's not even good.
yeah. And we hear it all the time that, well, they did this, and this, an air test, the tape lift, and a swab. Well, if you did it from all the wrong areas, it's not really going to matter. It's the same as an ERMI. If you go take an ERMI from, let's say, my desk that I clean all the time, and don't take it from a bookshelf over here, like
Right.
this is always clean. So of course you're not going to pick anything up. And
Yeah.
it's interesting because it all comes together just like the medical side. And I say this to my clients a lot. Like, as a physician and a doctor, you can't just go off of what somebody's telling you to treat them. You've actually got to assess the person. It's the same on the home side. We can come in and look at a home and go, wow, there's water stains here and all sorts of stuff going on. But you've got to look at the patient and look at the home. So
Yeah.
I kind of wanted to bring that up because a lot of people think they're going to save money and they're going to skip a test from an IEP like myself, but they're going to go buy a mold armor kit. And I'm not picking on mold armor, but that's what they go see at Home Depot or Lowe's. And then they put that, and I'm sure you
Is
know
that
what
a
kit
plate?
it's an agar dish. Yeah.
Plate. Okay.
And then they leave it out for an hour and they seal it back up and then it starts growing mold. Well, they freak out because it's growing mold. And it's like, well, mold is naturally present.
Yep.
That's why we like the ERMI. So I explain it this way to my audience that when we do traditional mold testing, an air test, a tape lip, we're only getting the mold type at the genus level. Like we don't even know if it's pathogenic, allergenic, or toxigenic. So that's why the ERMI and the EMMA, in my opinion, are important because we have to say, okay, is it a mold species that's even capable of the mycotoxins? But on top of that, the ERMI is based on water damaged building materials.
Yeah.
So that's where, not to go down the deep rabbit hole over here, but a lot of times wet building materials can off gas and VOCs and formaldehydes that has nothing to do with mold. And so when we see that, it's like, hey, we have an issue. And it brings me back to that's why it's so important. And I hope our listeners understand this because I say it all the time. It's more important to have somebody on site to look at your home than it is to just do a single test. And
100%. For me, it's an entryway into convincing them to get the IEP out.
well, and once again, and I understand, a lot of people say, well, it's so expensive, but on the other hand,
It's all
how much
expensive.
does it cost you to lose a week of work or,
Yeah.
all that kind of stuff. So coming back to the testing side of it, I have a quick question. What happens if you don't provoke? What you get a false positive or is it not
False
accurate?
negative.
Oh, a false negative.
Yeah, it's not that sensitive. It can miss a lot, so it's got a high false negative rate. So it needs to be provoked, or you could get a false negative.
Gotcha. So
Yeah,
let's just say
just
if,
the real-time labs one.
right. So, and you said that they can, even if they can't find a physician or someone locally, part of the course, you kind of can explain, what they can do. So what does our listener do though? For real-time labs, do they have to have a
Yeah, they can buy
physician?
that directly on a link in the course.
Oh, okay, perfect. Because
Yeah.
that's a lot of the times the questions that I have no idea how to answer that. But I want to pivot a little bit and go to the treatment and how you do it and in the order because for our listeners, it's so similar with mold remediation. It's very important. Like one of the most important things,
Containment and
yeah, containment is number one priority.
yeah.
You don't contain it, it's like a cancer. So, can you explain to our listeners the importance and the order that you do treat people?
Yeah, sure. So the order, what I set out to create was so people get into trouble when they try to treat it themselves because they read things and they talk and they have their Facebook groups and they'll start some binders, but they don't know if they're the right binders for them. And I get people who they will start cholestyramine, which is a really strong binder at full dose. Like, I mean, I would have people start at a quarter packet and work their ways up slowly, make sure it's not too much detox for them, but they'll do that 4 times a day and then they'll make themselves debilitated until they're
Wow.
suicidal and in bed. And you just can't detox more than the body can get out in the urine, the stool, and the sweat. And so in mold, you should always feel better or neutral. You should never feel worse. If you feel worse when you're increasing your doses or going into the next phase, then it's too much. Your body can't detox it. And what it's going to do is just move things around then. It'll mobilize these toxins, but it'll move them somewhere, which could be worse than where they were in the first place. And so, which just reminded me of like people trying to pull the wet material out and then the mold spores and mycotoxins going all over their without containment. Sorry, I was just thinking the analogy was perfect. But so there's an order and you got to be patient. You have to wait till your body is ready for this. So like I could give the example of like some people will get a biofilm buster because they hear that like if to get to mold, you've got to get through the biofilm, which is true. But if you open up biofilm in the beginning before you've got the right binders in place to like catch the mold that's released and the mycotoxins and the right like glutathione and everything else and your body knows how to detox it, it's now trained. If you just open up biofilm in the beginning, you're just going to flood their system with a ton more mold and mycotoxins and they're already sick. You have to do it like when it's time. Like biofilm comes last. So like my binding, glutathione, nasal sprays, organ detox and drainage support all happens first, and for a while until your body's doing it really well and you've kind of taught it and trained it how to pull things out. And it's a really step by step, and like every 2 days go up one capsule. If you feel this, go back down. It's like designed to, because I think those of us that do mold well, it's a lot of like brainstorming with the patient. So wait, you feel worse? Okay, what exactly were you doing, and when did you add that thing in, and when did you start that thing, and are you having bowel movements? And so I try to get all that sort of built into the course. But yeah, the order is important, or you can make yourself more sick, and people make themselves more sick all the time.
You mentioned the whole people on the home side of it, and I just want to address this with our listeners because I can't stress the importance of why you don't just spray mold. When you do that, you're first and foremost, if it's a toxigenic mold, you're more or less, I like to use the analogy of a
Aerating
snake
it.
or a porcupine. Like that snake, if once again this is a toxic mold, when it feels threatened, it's going to bite you and release its venom. Well, a toxigenic mold is going to do the same thing. And as soon as those
Exactly.
mycotoxins are released, they're anywhere. They're a
And the
separate entity.
fabric of your walls.
Exactly. And once again, people go to YouTube, they go to Dr. Google or whatever you want to call it, and they just start spraying things. And you just explained the medical side, why our listeners are like, I get it. Some people can't afford it. But on the other hand, like you're going to make yourself really sick. But I want to go back to something you said that's interesting. Touch a little bit more on when you start the detox, the process. You said that your body's going to react, but it shouldn't like make you bedridden, correct? Is that what you said?
It should make you feel worse. No, you
Right.
should feel either better or nothing the whole way through. If you got to back up, you're not doing it right. If you feel worse at any
Okay.
point.
And that's a good point that I think our listeners should understand that. Like I've heard people say, yeah, I was really sick for the first couple of
People
weeks.
think that, yeah, that they have to suffer through and that they get it mixed up with Lyme because they're both biotoxin and Lyme has herxing. And you often do feel worse before you get better in Lyme, but it's not really true with mold. It's die off. So I like to explain it this way. So imagine, so you've got the right binders in place. And so your binders are binding mycotoxins and maybe some actual mold in the GI tract and pulling them out in the stool. Your glutathione is helping your body metabolize all the different mycotoxins to get it out in the urine, the stool, and the sweat. You've got an antifungal nasal spray because this is the most common area of colonization. And then you've got some organ detox support that's helping open up your own detoxification channels. Anyways, you're doing this and the binders are constipating, so you have to increase your magnesium or whatever you use for that. And so you're now like you're at full doses and you've been doing this for a while and having daily movements, the rest of the cells in your body will get the signal that there's a way out for these toxins. And the toxins are toxic to these cells. They want to dump them. And so if they dump, your whole body cells dump more than you can get out in the urine, the stool, and the sweat. It doesn't get you there any faster. It's just moving stuff to different places. So if you feel worse, you back off on your dose, you wait a few weeks and then try going back up. Does
So
that make sense?
yes.
Yeah.
You brought up something that comes up all the time, and I know we talked about it last year, but just touch on the whole, not necessarily, I mean, you can talk about the connection with Lyme and mold sickness, but on the other hand, is it common to be misdiagnosed with Lyme when it's actually mold toxicity? Is that common or no?
So in many Lyme cases, there's mold, and mold is sort of the main reason why the Lyme is chronic and the body can't clear it. Yes, I sort of, right? So
Yeah,
they might get the Lyme diagnosis, but if they don't know they have mold and they go down the Lyme treatment road, they're just never going to get better until they treat the mold. And
exactly.
they always treat the mold first. Could they get missed? Yeah, you could get misdiagnosed probably with because you can have both.
Are they similar symptoms as far as?
There is. So they're both biotoxin illness, which makes them similar. You know what biotoxin is, or do you want me to define it for the
Yeah, go
listeners?
explain that to our listeners so they just
Yeah.
understand.
So biotoxin is something that is secreted by a living organism. So an animal, plant, bacteria, virus, mold, fungus, whatever, that's pathogenic or disease causing to humans. And so mold secretes, mycotoxins, which are biotoxin, and Lyme co-infections all secrete biotoxins as well. And so there's a lot of overlap in symptoms. There's a couple in my head that I think like are discrete that help me kind of tease out what's doing what. And then there's a co-infection in Lyme disease called Bartonella, and Bartonella symptoms and mold symptoms are really similar.
Okay.
Like it's almost like the top 10 are the exact same ones, and then there's some things that are unique and different about each, but they can present a lot alike.
Okay. Yeah, because it always seems like when people talk about the medical side of it that, and this has just been my experience with my clients, but most of the time I hear them say, yeah, I was being treated for Lyme, but it wasn't even, it was mold toxicity. But
I think the reason the Lyme remained chronic in their system or became reactivated was because they're living in a moldy space.
exactly.
So it doesn't necessarily mean they don't have like some remote history of
Right.
Lyme, but
So
it's often the why Lyme becomes that. It becomes opportunistic in the presence of mold.
exactly. Another thing, kind of going back to your course. So when somebody wants to take the course, we're going to put links in the description of the podcast, but kind of walk them through
What
the
does it look like?
steps that they're going to go through. Like, do they first sign up for the course and then they have to go find a doctor that you recommend them to? Just kind of walk our listeners through that.
Yeah, sure. So there's a couple free webinars coming up, one on the 15th and one on the 20th at 6 o'clock Mountain Time. And in the webinar, you'll just learn a lot more about the course. So you can, make a more educated decision if you wanted to join or not. And then when you actually register for the course, you'll immediately get an email and a client portal. And it'll have the first 9 modules of the course ready for you to go ahead and get started on. There's a course companion guide, a terminology guide, a resource guide, a find a physician guide, a biotoxin relief guide, all kinds of resources. And there will be a community forum for people doing the course together. And so the idea of giving the 9 modules in the beginning is that then they can do those on their own time. And that gets them up to where they get their testing done. And then it usually takes 2 to 3 weeks for test results. So then the course will start on June 17th. It'll be once a week on Mondays at 5 for 8 weeks. And so then
Okay.
they'll join live with me. And so we'll do 30, 40 minutes and then a Q&A. And there's actually 1 or 2 weeks that'll just be Q&A in the parts of the protocol where I know it can start getting messy, so
Right.
so there's a little more Q&A to help, people figure out their way.
How many weeks total is the course, did you say?
So when you join live, it's 8, and then you have 9 modules to do before then. They're short modules. They're 3 minutes or 10 minutes, and you can do it in under an hour. So yeah,
And I'm assuming the Q&As are gonna, in the webinars you'll have recorded so
yeah,
that they'll be built into the course.
exactly, yeah,
When
yeah.
does the
Then we'll
course go
package
live?
it all up and
Okay,
edit it and sell it as a thing. But this will be so the first one will be the only live cohort that I do. So the only one with Q&A and
gotcha.
all that. Yeah.
Yeah, so for our listeners, when they hear dates and stuff like that, they're like, well, do I have to hurry and do that? Just for our listeners to understand, stuff's going to
Oh,
be recorded. You can enroll in this course 2 months down the road or whenever.
yes, 100%. And it's like, even if you want to do it in the live, while we're doing it live, you don't have to be able to make Monday at 5. You will get that module that day and you can do it over coffee on Saturday morning or at the end of the night or, whenever it's convenient for you. But they are there. And that way, if you get tripped up on the protocol, something's not going well, you would know when to find, me for a
Right.
Q&A.
Right. And so for our listeners, and I'm not shaming anybody, but there's no excuses. Like they can start this course next month or in 2 months or whatnot, and they'll have obviously the advice from someone like you. And let's say somebody, so you said United States. Did you say Europe was like if
Yeah,
someone's
absolutely.
in Iran, can they do it or no?
Sure.
Okay. So anybody
I
can
don't
do it.
I don't have find a supportive physician for Iran or Europe, but
Right. But just to, because a lot
but
of
yeah,
people,
they
like
could absolutely do it.
surprisingly, I have like in Ireland and Scotland, and it's interesting talking to them. they tell me how wet and damp and cold it is, and I'm like, oh, I'm not used to that here. But I guess the reason I was asking is for anybody, even if they're in the military or, they're living abroad for whatever reasons, they can still benefit from this. It's not
Yeah.
just the United States. I want to bring up something, though. I probably should have brought this up earlier that I have a question about. We hear a lot about mycotoxins in food. Can you address the home side versus the food side? Because you mentioned something earlier that I hear all the time. It's not my home. I'm sure it's not my
Oh,
home.
everybody says that. I didn't think it was my home.
For our
um,
listeners that didn't listen last year, do you want to just kind of touch on that, what you went through quickly so that because
you mean my story with
yeah,
if
with
we
your
do a quick
son.
version? Sure.
Yeah.
It was in 2013. My son was, I think, 8 years old when it first started. He started like limping and getting stiff, and like he had weird anxiety he never had before. And then, so I was testing him for things because I was treating Lyme and I didn't know much about mold. I didn't know anything about mold really, but I was treating Lyme patients, and eventually I got a positive Lyme test for him and kind of started treating him and brought him out to see Dr. Stephen Harris in California, who I think is the greatest Lyme doc ever. And he gave me a real-time labs urinary mycotoxin for Kai, for my son. And we brought it home and did it, and it was through the roof. And so now we knew what was actually the issue. And we started him on phase 1 detox. He got like a tiny bit better until we remediated, sold the house, and got out of the exposure. And so, yeah, once he got out of the exposure and he was started on phase 2 detox, he got better pretty quickly.
Yeah.
But he was in bed for 6 months. So what had happened was I smelled a musty smell in his room. I had a very sweet family-run construction company out to look at it for me, and they said, yeah, there's a little water leak up there. And so they were going to fix it while we were out of town just to make it easier for the kids. And so they fixed it while we were out of town. I knew nothing about containment. I knew nothing about negative air. I knew nothing about it at all. And we got home, and Kai like got in bed after our trip and didn't get out for 6 months. He was just in 9 out of 10 pain, couldn't finish his school year, couldn't play soccer, couldn't do anything. It was horrible. And that's because I didn't know any better. Or, I just thought they could take the wet material out of the attic through the house. And they didn't know any better. It's not even
Right.
that they didn't know. It's
Right.
crazy. It happens. It just happens all the time. And I really do tell patients, like, if you can't get rid of it correctly, like just leave it where it is.
Yeah.
You're
Yeah.
gonna make everything will get worse. I promise you. Like, just don't do anything with it then.
Yeah. I compare it to asbestos. So for our listeners, I don't talk about this very often, but so in 1978, the government outlawed ACMs, which is asbestos containing materials, in building materials. They still use a little bit of asbestos, but if you have asbestos, like a popcorn ceiling or siding, insulation, vermiculite's what it's called. It's actually a crazy, so you're looking up.
Is that is that it?
But if so, let's just say your ceiling has a popcorn ceiling and it's asbestos, you're actually better off leaving it alone, because once you disturb it,
Oh,
that's when it becomes airborne. So we use the term encapsulation. I don't
uh-huh,
like that
uh-huh.
term in mold.
Right,
It's just
right,
not a good thing in my opinion.
right.
We just did a government job and they loved that term. And I was pulling my hair out. I'm like, encapsulation? No, you don't want to encapsulate it. But my point is it's similar with mold, because once you start messing with it, that's
Yeah.
when you expose yourself. And you touched on something that I've say all the time. I've said it 4 or 5 times today. The containments are so important. And to explain to our listeners, the reason it is because we want to control the air inside the area that we're removing the mold. Now, there will be people that'll say, well, what if, these molds release mycotoxins and they're already spread throughout the home? That's fine. We'll address that after we're done removing ground zero. But if you can't control what's going on in ground zero, exactly what happened with your home, I don't believe people are doing it on purpose. I don't. I think a lot of it's just ignorance. They don't know. They're like, oh, it's just mold. Mold's fine. But
Yeah, you don't know what you don't know. I
yeah.
mean, yeah.
And your story is a perfect example as to you saw it happening with your son. And I can't imagine being the mother and you're a doctor. You're just like, what do we do? So explain then what the process was after that. You more or less moved out of the home, correct?
Yeah. So the final part of the story is that so in 2013 was the Boulder floods, and our entire block flooded, and we thought like we made it out okay. But so we had a crawl space like under the entire house. Like some places it's really small, and some places you can stand in it, and there was 3 feet of water under the entire thing.
Wow.
But airborne sport traps in the red.
Wow.
So
That's crazy.
it was pretty bad. We had to remediate in order to sell it, but I just his mom, I was just like, I don't, this is so bad. I just don't think he's ever going to get well in this house. Like I just like, and also like the house kind of represented the sickness to me, and it was bad enough that I just really didn't know if you could get it out of the fabric.
It brings up something that I just talked to a client about this morning. They're dealing with a botched remediation project that was by one of those franchise companies, and they came in and didn't do the proper containments. And she was asking me, she's like, "So do I have to get rid of our couches and everything?" And I said, "Yeah, it's a term we say all the time, and they hate us for it. You do have to start with nothing." Now, is that what you have to do? Well, no. I mean, you could do whatever you want, but the problem we have is those mold spores and the mycotoxins, when something is porous, like, and I call it a smack test. So, like, if you smack my desk, there's nothing that's going to fluff out of it. You smack your mattress or your couch, think of all the stuff that comes out. My point is, there's a reason we tell everybody you have to get rid of everything. I have a client right now in New York that she moved from one moldy apartment to this newer, fancier apartment, and
Brought everything.
she brought some things. She got a new couch and but didn't get it. She got a new mattress, but she didn't get a new frame. And my point is that's why we tell everybody get rid of everything because we don't know what's contaminated. Now, from an IEP's perspective, can we keep your desk or your kitchen table? Of course, there's things we know aren't porous enough that we can keep. But on the other hand, you're just bringing mycotoxins and maybe toxigenic mold spores from one home to the next. So it's an interesting thing. Our listeners are probably like, I hate it when Steve says this, that we have to throw everything away. That's just kind of what we have to tell you because you would literally have to test every single piece of furniture with one Ermi. And one Ermi's what, $300-$400?
Hmm.
So that's the only way we would know if you could save something. But going back to what I was asking you, explain to our listeners how quickly your son started to improve once you removed yourselves from the home.
Pretty immediate. Phase 2 antifungals. We got him out of the house. I mean, he was going back to school within a couple of weeks. Like,
Okay,
he still needed like rest days, like he wouldn't go 5 days a week immediately. But by like so this was maybe October or something. I know by the January semester, he was full time in school and playing soccer 6 days a week. Like
perfect.
full on. But from the minute we got out until then, in those 3 months, he was getting better every day. I mean, he could go out on the trampoline, he could kick a soccer ball, he could do, see friends and do some school, and then he'd just get a little more worn out.
As far as the food perspective,
Oh, the
let's
food
kind of,
didn't answer that.
yeah, let's pivot back to that because
Sure.
I hear it all the time. It's not my home, it's the food. And, I did a podcast about mycotoxins several months ago. And on the food side of things, the USDA spends billions of dollars making sure there's not mycotoxins in food. But on the other hand, everybody wants to say, no, it's not my home because I get it. There's some emotional attachment to that.
And it's expensive.
Yeah. But address the crowd that's like, no, it's food. Because for the
Yeah.
most part, what I've heard, and I think Dr. Campbell at my Myco Lab is where I heard it, and I can't remember for sure, but more or less, yeah, food could make you sick, but nothing like the environment can. Can you address that for our listeners?
Yeah. So, in my opinion, the amount of mycotoxins we get from the food that we eat is a drop in the bucket compared to living in a water damaged building and what you're
Okay.
exposed to in the air day and night, for 24 hours a day. It's like it's tiny as
Minimal.
far as I'm
Okay.
concerned.
And so here's my
I
theory
don't
behind it.
even think people need to do a mold-free diet to get better. I mean,
Right.
I don't have my patients do it and they all get better.
Exactly. So here's my opinion on it and my take on it. In my opinion, you have a moldy home that has active mold growth. It's toxigenic mold colony. It's still reproducing. It's reproducing more and more mycotoxins. So it's continuously releasing those mycotoxins. Whereas a food, it might have mycotoxins on it, but for the most part, and this is just my opinion, I'm not a scientist, mycotoxins aren't able to reproduce because it's a byproduct of the mold. So that's my take on it, and that's how I explain it to my clients. Like,
Oh, I see. I see. Right.
does
Like
that
you've
make
got
sense?
one thing that like can replicate and make communities and babies, and one other thing that's more like an end product that, isn't making more of itself.
Right.
Yeah, I just really don't think people get super mold sick from mycotoxins in
Okay.
their
And I,
just
I
don't.
love hearing that from a doctor because
And a mold doctor, not like a doctor
yes.
that doesn't
Yeah,
believe in mold.
yeah. Well, yeah, exactly. But a lot of people and it's trying to convince themselves so that they don't have to deal with the home side of things. I hear it all the time. It's food, it's food. And I tell them, I'm like, I don't have any experience in that, but from what I've heard and what I've seen, it's minimal. So before we start wrapping this up, just explain to us, and I like to correlate it with myself. Explain to our listeners how important, because we just talked about it. How important is it to have a mold specialist like yourself on the medical side versus just my GP?
Oh, your GP will tell you that there's no such thing as mold toxicity.
They probably won't know how to test, they won't know how to treat. And I guess what I'm trying to get at is a lot of people, they say, well, it's, my insurance won't cover it. And, maybe we can touch on that just a little bit. Like, because there are things, correct me if I'm wrong, there are things that you can bill their medical insurance for. Am I correct?
Yeah, like I bill all the regular blood work. Real-time labs is actually contracted with some insurance companies. But yeah, I use it wherever I can for testing and stuff.
Yeah.
That
I
answers
actually
your question.
spoke to on the environmental side at Real Time Labs. They just got bought out by US Biotech.
No, I heard Dr. Hooper told me they're not going to change the way that they do their testing, are they?
That's what I was talking to. Paul is the environmental side that I deal with, and he doesn't think so, but he's not sure. So it's kind of a
Oh man, that would stink.
because you know how I mean, if you sold your company, I mean, it's kind of out of their hands.
It
But
is a bit bad. I think Dr. Hooper is staying for a year or two or something.
yeah, I don't know all the ins and outs, but Real Time Lab, it's interesting to talk about them because when I talk about the EMA testing, it's a medical or not medical, environmental mold and mycotoxin. So it's two different tests. It's like the ERMI, and then it's the mycotoxin side. And so for our listeners, Real Time Lab, they do the medical side of things. And so it gives them some credibility that they created the environmental side somewhat based on the medical side. And
Hmm.
yeah, Real Time Labs I just started working with them.
Oh,
And I'm impressed. They have some great videos. They have webinars that are older ones from a few years ago.
yeah.
So much educational stuff there. So
Yeah.
but before we wrap up, is there anything else you'd like to say, Dr. Fox?
I think we covered most of it. I'll make
Okay.
sure that you've got all the links and everything if any of your listeners are interested. And thank you so much for having me.
You bet. Well, on behalf of all of our listeners, we know it's rare to get somebody that has the expertise like you do on the medical side, but we appreciate you being on the Toxic Mold podcast. For all our listeners, have a great week.
Thank you for listening to this episode. Make sure you go to our website at cnccontractorservices.com and sign up for the mold investigation checklist. Again, go to cnccontractorservices.com and get your free mold investigation checklist today. You can also on cnccontractorservices.com find out more about Steve's courses and books and consultations. Once again, go to cnccontractorservices.com.